Welcome back, politics nerds, to the Politicast, the podcast dedicated to learning your policies like your ABCs. For those of you just joining, the Politicast is an educational podcast intended to educate young and future voters on government systems, current events, and intricacies of elections within the United States. Our goal is to increase voter turnout and interest in politics among the youth population. So, without further ado, let's get into today's episode. Democracy runs on numbers, from voter turnout percentages to campaign finance. Furthermore, math isn't just about equations, rather, it's about empowerment through various facets. Today, we're going to look at Mission Math, a not for profit organization dedicated to serving the whole community through free math tutoring, in building confidence in underserved communities and helping them pursue their interest. Saranya and Ria are the co-founders of Mission Math and have grown Mission Math into a now international organization from a small tutoring program they founded in their middle school in 8th grade. So, without further ado, let's dive into today's episode. So, today we are going to be going through a series of questions that dive into the impact of this organization and correlating it to the main theme of this podcast, politics and voting. So I'm going to start off with my first question, which is what has inspired the creation of Mission Math and what is the main goal of this organization?
Well, when Tarani and I were in 8th grade, we created this IB community project where basically we were working with the kids in 5th grade at our middle school, helping them with math, especially the kids who were struggling. And we observed this vicious cycle where essentially kids, especially out of like the pandemic, this was just after we returned to schools, and with all these challenges that came with the pandemic, a lot of kids were really behind. And we observed this vicious cycle where kids they had low self-esteem and that worsened their academic performance because they were like, why should I even try, and then that would worsen their self-esteem, and then worsen their academic performance, and it was just this vicious cycle. um, and upon seeing this within our students and our peers within this project, we knew that we needed to increase the scope of our efforts. So after 8th grade, we created Mission Math, so the summer before our freshman year. So our services are basically centered around increasing student self-esteem, targeting this vicious cycle, and then also increasing students' understanding and enjoyment of math. So helping them better understand like what they're learning in school, helping them with their foundational math to increase their overall math competence, and then also increase like their passion, so how they view math, how they view themselves as students, and really just making that learning process more fun and enjoyable. We also really try to focus on individual student needs and like learning styles. Um, to make our services just more like impactful, like more tailored to specific students so that we could really address these issues that we were seeing with individual students, and help them with their self-esteem.
Yeah, and from like knowing this organization for a long time, I've seen how like profound its impacts are on these on various people and various kinds of communities. So just a little bit more to learn about the organization. Can you walk us through some of the initiatives or programs that Mission Math has available for people?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, I'd like to start with all of our services are 100% free and virtual. There's not a single one that costs money. Sometimes we do hold in-person events, but all the educational ones are completely virtual. And Mission Math in general, it offers, again, free tutoring, which includes private tutoring and our school year courses. Private tutoring is completely one-on-one. A tutor will work with you on a weekly or bi-weekly basis, depending on how often you'd like it to happen, to really help you with school, make sure that you're doing super well in school, or, aid in our school year courses as well. And our school year courses, those are more group courses, but we keep small class sizes so then you can keep the classroom sort of environment where you build off of each other, um, while also getting that one-on-one, personalized kind of support check-in, kind of a system in there as well. And our summer camps are very similar to our school year courses, but obviously they happen during the summer, and they're 4 weeks long, every single day. And our workshops, they really focus on the real life application of math because we really want to show admission math why math matters. And this is something we really aim to do with our workshops, and in fact, our newly introduced YouTube lessons as well. A couple of the new ones we've released are about roller coasters in math and racing in math. And these are super cool if you want to learn, how math relates to any interest you could possibly have. And this is, again, as I said earlier, all centered around the application of math because we really want to focus on why math matters and to help students understand, the value of learning and increase real world skills like problem solving and analytical thinking skills, along with, their understanding of mathematical concepts.
Yeah, and on that note, relating to real world skills and problem solving and analytics, obviously I want to connect the topic of math and your guys' work with today's topic, which is relating to data and especially in politics, which is something I've kind of touched on in the last two episodes of my podcast, especially when talking about the election of 2024, which is going to be probably a larger topic when talking about like data, polling, etc. So, just as like a foundational question, what do you guys know to be the role of math in modern day politics? And obviously, especially because the data is the main topic for today, what specifically about data do you know relating to politics?
So modern day politics are really just rooted in statistics and probability, especially with data. So with data analysis, with polling, predictive modeling, statistical analysis, we use data analysis to gauge public opinion on certain policies and election candidates, and to help analyze voting patterns like voter demographics. So for example, when we're looking at like Gen Z in the 2024 presidential election, we use this data analysis to identify what percentage of Gen Z that was eligible to vote did vote, to identify demographics, if this was a certain race, geographic location, sex, age, all of that. So we really use data analysis and understanding and interpreting the results of voting, so voter turnout, to better understand how we can increase voter education. And also candidates and like policymakers, they use this to change how they market or campaign to really help gain like more public support. So they use data analysis to really just shape their campaigning style. And then voters, they also must understand economic issues. So it's really, really important that voters have this mathematical literacy, especially statistical literacy, because they need to be able to understand these economic issues like inflation, to be able to like understand what candidates are saying that they'll do about these issues. So they have to understand economic forecasts and policies that candidates propose in order to make informed decisions when voting. So it's really important to have a solid foundation in statistics and probability as a voter, or really just as a citizen, in order to make informed decisions and really just understand modern day politics. And then finally, we use math with like maximizing fairness and accuracy in politics and also like boosting transparency. So for example, with like ballot counting, we need to ensure that there's accuracy in ballot counting, and we use math to do that. And then from there, we use data analysis to really understand and interpret the ballot counting. So demographics, voter turnout, all of that. So really just all of this comes back to math. We use math to um, create this data and then also to interpret it, to make change in politics.
Yes, 100%. And I kind of want to expand a little bit more on the fact that you talked about voter education. I feel like in today's day and age, we can all agree that there's so much information out there. There's so much social media. There's so many different people telling you different things at different times of day. And so it's really hard to sift through all of that information. But like you put it in a very clear and concise way, I think modern day like politics is rooted in statistics and probability because that's what we can use to draw logical conclusions and we have the numbers to back up certain things. So data is critical in getting a clear understanding of a variety of things because we'll talk about this more obviously, but how much like data collection spans throughout the political world. It's not just like polling, but it's beyond that. So I think that that was a really strong point that you made talking about how, it does lead to voter education and how, if you want to be an informed voter in today's day and age, definitely looking at the numbers and looking at the statistics is key. So that kind of leads me into talking about the next question that I wanted to ask you guys are like, what are different ways that people can collect data in present day?
Yeah, so we have surveys and polls as are really common to like gauge public opinions on certain like policies or candidates. And then we have census data, which is collecting like demographic information about a population. So for example, census data on like the people who support a certain candidate or like, support a certain policy. So you might see this a lot on the news, these surveys and polls and census data, because we use these to identify social and economic trends, which are really important in this country, as then policymakers and candidates, like for elections, they then take these trends that they're noticing based on this data to make changes to their campaigning and marketing to gain public support. And then also, especially in this presidential election, social media analytics were really prevalent as the two presidential candidates, they use social media as a really major tool to campaign. So we use social media analytics with math to track engagement, to gauge the public's feelings towards different policies and candidates. Um, and again, with this, we use like data analysis. So it really just does come back to math. And then there's regression analysis, which is identifying relationships between different variables. So for example, between age and voting behavior. So we use regression analysis in identifying these trends of certain demographics or communities to then increase like what Anushka talked about with voter education. Um, and then also probability theory, which is predictive models for election outcomes. So again, we saw this a lot in the 2024 presidential election, but predicting which candidate will win, which policy will be more favorable, all of this, it comes back to probability. And then with all of this data, all of these data collection techniques that I discussed, we can visualize these using graphs and charts. So like bar graphs, pie charts, line graphs, histograms, to interpret the data and to visualize it. And it's really important to be able to visualize this data because that's how we can really easily analyze patterns in voter demographics and turnout, which we can then use to enact change in how we're approaching politics as a society, um, to make it more fair and accurate and transparent for everyone.
You hit a lot of points there, especially in talking about the different ways we have polls. I think different types of, sorry, data collection. Especially, I want to like kind of go through your list and just kind of expand a little bit more on how they're related to the political world. So you mentioned surveys and polls, which are, I think, especially prevalent in today's political environment, especially in the 2024 election. And as Sharon and I will get into a little bit later, there's a lot of like another bias and a lot of issues that come into polls. But I think it's interesting to see like polling data and a lot of, personally from my experience, a lot of voters who are maybe not as educated as the people technically rely a lot on polling data, and especially if you see one candidate is ahead, it's kind of called the bandwagon effect, and you see a lot of support for that candidate, you're going to tend to want to vote with that candidate because the data kind of tips in their favor as well. And your point about the census demographic data was also really interesting to talk because it's really interesting to see like what the purpose of the census is and how the census is used in a political like atmosphere, despite being like very, very statistical, lots of numbers, but how it's kind of used to see like what is changed politically and socially and what stayed the same, and what can policymakers use to prioritize what to change. So I kind of want to talk a little bit more about like this interpreting the data and seeing how we can use the data to make a difference. So my next question for you would be, how does the interpretation of data help the political field?
So that's a great question, and I want to start with bias, as you mentioned. There's a lot of bias when it comes to, what polling techniques you want to use, what sampling techniques you want to use, who you're, sending your surveys and polls out to. And even if you send it out to the entire population, there's that issue of non-response bias, where some people will just straight up not respond. And then obviously you lose that data, right? You don't have that data on you to analyze. And you have to really take that in account when you're interpreting your data. Because if you don't take that into account, you're going to get a very biased and very incorrect view of what your population value, whatever you're looking for in the population is going to be. You may have, a semi-accurate a sample value, um, but that doesn't necessarily correlate very strongly with the population value if your sampling is off. And this is where, like, census comes in, where census is you're getting every single person in the population's, data. It's very difficult to conduct, and that's why it's not done very often either. But it does give you a whole much more holistic view of what your population looks like. Um, and non-response bias is only one of the many biases. I think, Anushka, you wanted to talk about a couple more.
There's an inherent bias in like question wording. Also, when you have yes or no questions versus open-ended questions, open-ended questions are typically not ideal for taking data. And polling, yes or no questions are good, but even in how you phrase the yes or no question is kind of important. Asking someone like, do you support this? Or do you support taxing this is like very different because there's just like kind of a compound sense to certain questions. So it's hard to elicit perfect answers, yes or no, because people may have mixed opinions on two different topics. There's also response bias, which also comes into voting kind of on the bandwagon effect. It's a similar thing to that. It's that everyone wants to conform to social norms, or almost everyone. So if everyone is seeing like, okay, this person, they're voting in favor of this policy, and so is this person, and so is this person. So in the poll, I'm going to respond to what is the socially desired outcome. And just like finally to add, like how you're serving people, as Saranya mentioned, is also very, very important. And, the overweighing of certain groups, because statistically speaking, there's people who are more likely to vote early and they're associated with the Democratic Party, but there's also people who are more likely to, take the time to fill out a poll, which is, affects how you're taking the survey. Yeah.
No, yeah, definitely. Like leading bias is a very big problem. Um, Leading, the whoever you're trying to get data from answering in a specific direction and not getting the actual value when the actual value is what matters. And then there's obviously again overweighing, which comes into undercoverage bias. If you don't send out your polls or surveys to a certain part of the population, you're not going to get their data, and your data is going to be inherently biased because of that as well. And this all leads to my general point of how interpreting data really comes down to knowing the data, knowing its biases, etc., and then the context around it and really using this to see trends and patterns. Like, how similar to how marketing campaigns work by finding out, what kind of consumer would like to buy their product the most. Political campaigns use, as Ria said earlier, social media analytics and stuff like that to determine who's going to vote for them, how to increase their voter base. It's like stuff like that. Because what they're aiming to do at the end is, again, increase their voter base as much as possible, gain as many voters as possible. This really comes down to understanding, interpreting the data in a way that you can, build something off of it. You can take some sort of action to get this many votes. And additionally, predicting outcomes is completely based on the interpretation of the data from previous elections, for example. Um, like for prediction electoral outcomes, statistical models and past data are utilized, as they can help, predict how current voter behavior would look like. Because, it's all about using the past data to really see how the present is really going to turn out. And yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And as both you and Ria mentioned, I think like the relevance of data, and especially in the 2024 election, she was talking a lot about how Gen Z was a very mobilized population, or they wanted Gen Z to mobilize and mobilize that voter base. And they used a lot of different techniques, and statistics was important in that to see like why, because statistically speaking, my first episode actually related a lot to this, like the low voter turnout amongst youth. And so I think that it's really important that like we use data to see how we can improve it and why it's such a prevalent problem, which both of you touched on. And obviously, continuing to acknowledge that data has biases, and there's obviously always going to be fault. So like going into my next question, like data's never going to be perfect, and there's always going to be some bias, some kind of, something that'll trip up your data. So, what is margin of error, and can you tell me a little bit more about your knowledge behind this idea?
Yeah, for sure. So margin of error is basically how reliable you think your data is, how confident you are that it has, the true value, the true population value, um, based on, like whatever your sample value was, whatever data you would concluded you'd interpreted from from sampling and all. And this really comes down to two things. There's confidence intervals, which statistics term, but like some of the common ones are 98% or 95% or 99%. And this is basically how confident you are in the specific interval that you have your true value. And again, this is like based off of what your sample value is. So you could be 90% confident, which would be a much smaller margin of error, a much smaller confidence interval, but you're less confident that it's in there. And then whereas 99% is a huge interval or relatively larger interval, but it has a much larger margin of error. You're less sure which specific value it is, but you're more sure that it's in your specific interval. Um, and basically, some ways you can decrease margin of error is by increasing sample size. Especially if your um, population has a lot of variability, that since that increases margin of error. If you get more people in your population, if you sample more people, you're more likely to get the true population value or something closer to the true population value because you've accounted for more or less all of the variability. And a couple of examples are, if you're polling a certain population to figure out how many support a certain candidate, you could be, 60% sure that, you could be 90% sure that 60% of the people in your population would support your data. And this could maybe be like a 5% confidence interval where it's like plus or minus 5%. So you could be like, it could, in reality, the population value could be anywhere from 55 to 65%. As this sample value is like kind of right in the middle, and then you base your confidence interval off of that.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like as just someone who's observed a lot of like political data, I think it's very important to consider the margin of error. As you mentioned, there's different types of it. So typically most people would say the desired margin of error is plus or minus 2 to 3% in any kind of poll or statistical survey taken. But I think it's important because a lot of people overlook it. It's kind of, not as prevalent on a graph where you would see it like in the footnotes or something like that. So margin of error, like as you mentioned, is so critical to understanding like where the data is may or may not be like off or how many percentage points it may be off by. And that might like inhibit like or, help almost the interpretation of the data, but it also might like inhibit it. But that kind of relates to how you're perceiving data. And especially since there's so much data constantly being thrown out at us, we should be able to understand like specific terms such as margin of error, especially in the political world, when it comes to interpreting data to make, conclusive results and interpretations, while acknowledging that yes, surveys and polls and certain methods will always have some kind of bias, but they're technically the most like accurate way of presenting information most times. So I want to kind of completely switch gears here as we conclude today's episode and talk a little bit about you guys' general perception of math in society. So, how do you guys, as mathematicians, see the integration of math into society as a whole?
So math is really just the foundation of society. The sciences, tech, medicine, are all of that's really built onto math, using math as a tool to interpret the world around us. And many consider math for that reason to be a universal language. It's something that connects all the different communities and societies across our world. It's something that pulls us together because it's something that we all really share and use.
Yeah, so like if you think about it, aliens aren't gonna know what English is, right? But they will know what math is because it is our way of explaining, as Ria said, the world around us. Everybody's trying to interpret the world around us. And since math is, an attempt to do that, it is considered like many would consider it a universal language and potentially a source to communicate with aliens, but
And math is really stigmatized. Despite like what Rania said, how it's such like an important and versatile tool, it's so stigmatized where um despite all its applications, many don't really understand it. And it's a big part of this is because of how schools approach it. Schools really try to approach math as like with a one size fits all method where this really just doesn't work for most students. It doesn't support their learning styles and their needs. So many students fall behind in math, and because math is sequential in nature, if you fall behind in the beginning, you'll really struggle throughout the rest of your academic career in math. Um, because of that, many people view themselves as just bad at math, or they view math as hard and useless. And math is so stigmatized because of that. And it's really important that as educators and as students, we change how we approach math, how we view math, and how we teach children about math in order to really help them understand how integrated math really is in society and how crucial it is that we understand math in basically every career that you can go into post your education, post like high school or college.
Yeah, 100%. I think even despite being someone who's less inclined to math, like I've seen it in almost every field. Like you'd be surprised, like math will show up in like English and the most like obscure ways. Like you'll constantly be surrounded by math and you don't even know it. Like checking the time right now, like that's related to math. So I feel like math is just so universal and like Sarad has said, just such a universal way of communicating. So even if you don't understand the person in front of you, like math is something that you can easily connect over. And so finally, like given the prevalency of math in the world today, how do you guys encourage students to get more involved in math?
Yeah, so one big thing we really focus on, this is something I've touched on, I think, several times already, but it's like the real life application of math. If people understand that math applies to the real world, that they will see it in the future, that matters beyond school, beyond like, the basic arithmetic you'll be learning, maybe basic algebra, that it's something you'll be using on a daily basis. It really helps them, understand why it matters and like encourage them to get involved further. And how we specifically do that is again focusing on the real life application of math, offering personalized tutoring, which really focus also on that support that is necessary that Ria talked about, especially since schools aren't able to cater to every single student because there's just not the capability to do that. Um, and that's why I really focus on, personalized tutoring, um, to aid students in school or, help them expand beyond school if, they're already like set with school. We also offer, more structured school year courses, pre-algebra, algebra 1, geometry, and algebra 2. If a student wants a more structured curriculum to complement their school curriculum. And then we're also working on partnering with schools to offer more extensive services because we really want to help every single student out there.
And also, like what Rania talked about previously with our workshops, we really use those to help students see how they can get involved with math outside of school, but how it applies to nature, robotics, um, really just the world around us. And that's really important when students they go outside and they see that math, is not just confined to like the classroom, but it's just everything around us. And it's really important that we understand this and we can help students get involved in this.
Yeah, and definitely. And as I mentioned, this is such an impactful organization. I've seen it like grow. And I've seen like how they've expanded into different types of fields related to so many different types of professions as well. And it's just such an amazing like organization. And I feel like it's been so impactful to so many communities, like I mentioned. So on that note, how can our audience get more connected to Mission Math?
So you can check out our Instagram at mission.math, which is where we post basically all of our updates about upcoming events or just things you should know. as a part of the Mission Math community. You can email us at any time at missionmath.info@gmail.com with questions, concerns, anything like that. We'll get a response back to you within about 24 to 72 hours. You can also check out our website at missionmathtutoring.org, which is where we post also some updates about our upcoming events. You can learn more about our mission and our services on our website. Um, so there are three great places to get more connected to Mission Math. And then also for more information, you can check out, you can search Mission Math Tutoring on TikTok, YouTube, and or LinkedIn, and find us there. But we also post updates and just things to know. So you can get connected to Mission Math on any of those platforms that we discussed. Again, just reach out to us anytime at missionmath.info@gmail.com if you have any questions.
Thank you so much. And also for anyone like interested, I will include the link in bio of this YouTube video and also on the Spotify link tree. There'll be like a little bit of like an info page for Mission Math, and it'll also be in our regular LinkedIn post per website. So plenty of ways to access Mission Math's information. So thank you so much for joining us today on the Politicast. We are really grateful to have an opportunity to speak to you both today, and thank you to all of our listeners as well. Today, we were able to meet the Mission Math co-founders and learn more about the interconnectedness of math and politics, and we also covered making a community impact and how you can get involved. As always, we end our episodes with a fun trivia question. So today's fun trivia question will be related directly to polling, and we're going to take a poll of which would make a better president, a dog or a cat. So this is kind of a funnier one. And so as always, make sure you answer in the comments below or on the Spotify poll, and we will be releasing the results in the next next episode. And yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to listen today, and we'll see you in the next one.